Well, welcome to all of you. It's nice to see so many people turning up on a rainy January evening. Really nice. You may not know me, but I am a member of the Parkes Institute. My name is Anna Koller. I'm in archaeology. So this year I'm co-hosting the PhD. No, I'm coordinating. That's a difficult word to say. Coordinating the PhD program with Parkes, alongside my colleague Scott Sue. So yeah, so it's my pleasure today to welcome you all to this Parkes Institute PhD roundtable discussion. And just to let you know kind of what the kind of plan of action is for this evening. We're going to hear first from Anushka Alexander-Rose, who will talk first for us about Vladimir Nabokov and his Wandering Jews, and then we'll have maybe a couple of time for a couple of questions after that, just for kind of maybe for clarification points or something that is super urgent that you want to ask Anushka. And then we will hear from Chee, who will talk about Jews versus Christians over Isaiah's given child prophecy. And then a couple of questions for Asha, but then we can move into a more of a kind of a discussion which kind of brings the two together. And it's a really interesting opportunity to bring together different periods of time, different kinds of research approaches, but and within different disciplines as well. So Anushka's in English and Asha's in history. I got that the right way around, didn't I? And so it's an interesting kind of interdisciplinary opportunity to kind of to see those connections. So beyond wishing you all a nice evening with us and Happy New Year and January and all that kind of thing, I think we should get on with the evening. So Anushka, do you want to share your screen with us?
Yeah. Cool.
And then, of course, if everyone can make sure they are muted, that would be good. I will also mute myself so that you don't hear me. And Anushka, take it away.
Thank you. I just wanted 1 second. Oh. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. I just wanted to kind of frame this paper as it's mostly an introduction to my methodology, and it's just a brief introduction and analysis of Agasphere, the text itself, but it's mostly looking at the methodological and kind of theoretical approaches from my thesis so far. Right, so Vladimir Nabokov and the Wandering Jews. So Vladimir Nabokov was born on the 22nd of April, 1899 in St. Petersburg into a family of intelligentsia. His father, Vladimir Dmitrievich Nabokov, was a lawyer and member of the Constitutional Democratic Party. His mother, Elena, was the daughter of a small noble family whose fortune came from trade and gold mining. Nabokov was educated at the Tenishev Academy, a private gymnasium which schooled children of the intelligentsia, as well as many Jewish students. After the October Revolution in 1917, the Nabokov family fled, and Vladimir went to Cambridge University to complete his degree in zoology and Romance languages. Following graduation, he moved to Berlin and joined a thriving émigré community, where he started writing and there produced some of his best Russian language works, such as Invitation to a Beheading and The Gift. He married the Jewish Vera Salonim, and they had a son, Dmitry. Due to rising anti-Semitism that his son and wife faced and a diminishing Russian community, they moved to Paris and shortly thereafter secured visas and ferry tickets to travel to America in 1940. In the US, Nabokov held academic roles at Wellesley and Cornell and wrote Penin, Pale Fire, and Lolita, amongst other texts, the successes of which allowed him to spend his final years in a hotel in Switzerland until his death in 1977. His wide-spanning life and career is touched by literary movements of modernism and postmodernism, covers both Russian and English language works, as well as England, Germany, France, America, and Switzerland as places. There have been countless academic monographs on Nabokov, but until now, no comprehensive study of the Jewish theme in his works. A limited number of articles have identified some Jewish characters and motifs, My thesis aims to go beyond discussion of isolated references and build an understanding of how Nabokov's wide approach to the Jewish theme can be characterized, and more generally helping us understand how he writes the other. My title, Vladimir Nabokov and His Wandering Jews, relates to what I believe is a governing motif throughout his works, the wandering Jew character. He first appears in Agasphere, a dramatic prologue written in 1923, and travels through many other of Nabokov's short stories and novels. Moreover, he acts as a prototype for the way that Nabokov writes the other as a whole, and the typography identify can also be applied to female characters or Black characters, as well as different othered identities. In her introduction to the Jew in the text, Linda Nochlin sets out how the history of literary imaginings of the Jew can be understood through excessiveness, but she isolates examples of deliberate refusal of narrative simplicity offered by Joyce and Proust. My thesis suggests that Vladimir Nabokov should be included alongside this pair of modernist giants, and that a comprehensive study is necessary in order to characterize the ambivalence inherent in his approach and comb through references to Jewishness that can be found throughout his works. Nochlin advises that as readers, we should examine the artists themselves in order to understand how they write about Jews and why. Are they Jewish or non-Jewish, more or less sympathetic to Jews, neutral or hostile? At various points in his writing and in his life, Nabokov is all of these. He is straightforwardly a non-Jew, but his Jewish wife and son afford him some intimate connection to this identity. There is evidence that he is sympathetic to Jews and the persecution they face, but is this only because he can bring a mirror to his own experiences of tyranny and exile? Neutrality to Jews can be found in his self-affirmed indifference towards history and politics. We can even see hostility in his jealousy of the way that his Jewish contemporaries could adjust to life in emigration with more ease than him, already being multilingual and possessing contacts abroad. Nabokov is ultimately an opportunist, finding within whatever he sees as an essential Jewishness, something that can be mined for his literature. For Nabokov, the Jew is everything and nothing. He can be the perfect figure of exile, the wandering Jew, stateless, nameless, and malleable, and thus emblematic of Nabokov's own emigre experience, imbued into his works as if autobiographical or aspirational. The Jew can also be divine or liminal, providing for Nabokov a route to the afterlife, or other world as he called it, where his father could be found prematurely, alongside many of his other literary creations who have untimely deaths. Or the Jew can be reduced to a victim of totalitarianism, be it in its Soviet or Nazi forms. In this way, the wandering Jew, or the Jew itself, is the antithesis of poshlost, which means vulgarity or banality, and so a way for Nabokov to establish his moral values without politicizing. So this is a text of Agasphere, the prologue. In 1923, as an exile in Berlin, Nabokov wrote Agasphere, a prologue intended to accompany a musical symphony. It was performed only once, and only the prologue here survives, published in an emigre journal. This early, understudied, and until now untranslated text is a product of the young Nabokov's literary education, influenced by Russian symbolist interest in the non-religious divine, Pushkin and Byron's itinerant heroes, and the verse of Heinrich Heine, imbued with Jewishness. Although in form and style it is unlike the rest of his cultural production, in theme, Agasphere acts as a prototype for many of Nabokov's later literary creations and preoccupations. The protagonist is a sinful exile, trapped by love, perverse and outcast. This character finds its way through various guises in Nabokov's Russian fiction as a stateless, liminal figure of service, before finding his eventual and evolved form in Humbert Humbert from Lolita. We can understand Agasphere as a composite of a Russian-European literary tradition, which deals in romantic heroes, historical quests, religious imagery, and the theme of love. The wandering Jew of this literary tradition, and as in Agasphere, is not a Jewish motif. In fact, it's lifted out of a history of anti-Semitism. But the character continues to be developed throughout Nabokov's writing, and his Jewishness becomes more present and more significant. Nabokov depicts the wandering Jew in Agasphere as a punished vagabond searching the earth for his estranged beloved, simultaneously experiencing history through the identities of other sinful figures. He uses lofty romantic language and biblical references and engages in clear elements of the traditional wandering Jew figure as found in other texts. For example, he assumes historical and religious identities such as Tiresias, Medici, Jean-Paul Marat, Judas, and Satan, associating him with heresy, sinfulness, and perversity. He chases his beloved, described as a sinner and a prisoner. She is surrounded by doves and angels. Central to his identity is his exile, which is expressed through the word tosca, which means either languishing, anguish, or yearning, as well as his being described as a prisoner in a vault. Finally, he can be understood as an artist, stating, "The whole chronicle of the earth is a book about me." And I've produced a full translation of this prologue, although sadly we don't have the rest of the text. However, the significance of this text is how it acts as a prototype for other characters in Nabokov's work and as a starting point to a central motif of his understanding of the Jewish other. The act of writing about Nabokov requires a variety of approaches. First, engaging with and at points rejecting how Nabokov himself wanted to be read and studied. He posited that a good reader should notice and fondle details, should have imagination, memory, and a dictionary, and that one cannot read a book, one can only reread it. However, he also insisted against reading his works through history, context, or ideas. My methodology, in some places, follows his direction on the ideas of rereading and identifying patterns, but on the other hand, challenges his intentions to be read outside of context, suggesting that such topics did not only interest him, but preoccupy him. My approaches include discussions of paranoid reading, the idea of writing Jewishness, and the kind of trio of ideas of modernism, postmodernism, and psychoanalysis. So for paranoid reading, if there is something excessive about the way that Jewishness is imagined in literature, then Nabokov's literary method can be seen as a model for this. Inherent to his writing and the way he wanted to be read is rereading and rereading, taking notes, finding characters or motifs that appear constantly and repeatedly throughout his texts. Could there be a more fitting way to write and read Jewishness? My paranoid methodology, painstakingly going through each work, using digital methods, identifying characters, and then looking for them in other texts, mimics the excessive paranoia of feeling Jewish itself. It also suggests that existing studies of the Jewish theme in Nabokov, which focus on a handful of obvious texts, miss out on the vastness of how Jewishness is present in his work. For example, if one only searches for the word Jew, they will find straightforward references in some of his texts. But in expanding this search, noticing the repetition of nameless, stateless, bilingual characters and their tendency to, for example, have thick eyebrows or coded Jewish names, his wandering Jews, the scope of this study is widened out. My thesis, of course, includes discussions of the Holocaust in Penin and in Lita, and reflections and condemnations of anti-Semitism in The Gift and Conversation piece. But it also identifies how Nabokov engages with the tradition of a slippery Jew, writing Jewishness in a slippery way. And this is encapsulated in the motif of the wandering Jew. Any attempt to characterize the manner in which authors write about Jews follows in a rich tradition of literary scholarship. Such work, building on and rejecting binaries of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, aims to understand how the type of the Jew is constructed in the literary imagination, and suggests some various examples whether it is even possible for an author, Jewish themselves or not, to ever be able to relieve themselves from such restrictive stereotypes. My thesis posits that Vladimir Nabokov may join these ranks, and that his engagement with the Jewish question consists of not only ambivalence, but rich detail, nuance, and self-contradictions, and that this is inherent to the slipperiness of writing the Jew itself. Linda Nochlin argues for going beyond attempts to find a real essential Jewishness, which doesn't really exist, instead focusing on the method itself. So she says, a reduced essence beyond the excessive mess of the stereotypical Jewish persona of art, literature, and propaganda, but rather that excessiveness itself, the almost hysterical repetitiveness of myths and exaggerations. The ideas of excess seem to mimic exactly Nabokov's theory of reading and writing. His leitmotif of the wandering Jew and the recurrent Jewish types or themes can be seen exactly as that hysterical repetitiveness of myths and exaggeration. Through this, we can characterize Nabokov as adding to an existing body of writers who engage in a Jewish typology, resorting in caricature or essentialism. Moreover, Nochlin considers the inextricable relationship between the modern construction of the Jew and the construction of modernity itself. This allows us to consider the modernist nature of Nabokov's authorship through a Jewish lens. Brian Cheyette's suggestion that it is the radical instability of the construction of the Jew which makes him the perfect vehicle through which a self-conscious literary modernism can explore the limits of its own foundations, helps us consider this. The wandering Jew type not only reflects an exilic identity, but a modern identity too, a preoccupation evident in many of Nabokov's earlier Russian works, such as The Gift. Furthermore, drawing on these connections from literary theory suggests that a study of the Jewish theme in Nabokov's works will also enhance an understanding of his modernist authorship, expanding the relevance and application of this thesis. A specific Russian Jewish context in his work is informed by Leonid Livak's studies, which draw on connections between Jewishness and Orientalism, considering the physicality of the Jew, and the addition of black eyes, thick lips, and a dark complexion to 19th century racially motivated images of Jewishness. This clarifies Nabokov's own use of dark imagery, both of color and of mysticism, which is used to describe some of his Jewish characters. For example, a wandering Jew type character in The Gift called Mr. Bush is described as like a conjurer, and the inventor in King Queen Knave, whose coded Jewish thick eyebrows wiggled like furry black caterpillars later in the novel, had let his beard grow and now looked like an Oriental priest in mufti. Livak's study of historical typologies and imaginations of the Jew in Russian literature help illuminate Nabokov's own descriptions, particularly his associations with Jewishness and Orientalism. Moreover, his study also provides a theoretical framing for understanding the wandering Jew itself as a type, for example, the Jewish helper figure, who he describes as meek and defenseless do-gooders who persist in their secondary role of a litmus test for the religious or secular virtues of the Gentile actor playing the subject. Moreover, Livak describes Jews as mediators between the living and the dead, as guides in a foreign land. And this contributes to my wider argument regarding the role of Nabokov's wandering Jews in their liminality between this world and the other world. As typical for writers whose works span the 20th century, Nabokov straddles both modernism and postmodernism. This thesis considers aspects of both. On the one hand, modernist, unreliable narrators, art for art's sake, and defamiliarization, and on the other hand, postmodern playfulness, intertextuality, and the collapse of traditional structure. As already established, Nabokov's construction of the Jew in his works is inextricable from the construction of his modernist authorship. Moreover, postmodernism allows for the imagined Jew, especially as part of Jewish history, to go beyond the perceived limits of fiction. In transgressing and rejecting Nabokov's intentions on how he should be read, I will also frame his many novels, short stories, and memoirs as exercises in life writing. Understanding the significance of life writing in Nabokov's works not only informs the autobiographical elements by creating a channel of communication between reality and fiction, such as identifying characters from Nabokov's biographies in his texts, but also allows us to find echoes between grander themes and motifs, such as the liminality of Jewishness or the fragility of history. Hermione Lee, in Body Parts, variously describes life writing as opening intimate links between the dead and the living, and describes the biographer as a ferryman from life to death. One of Nabokov's central preoccupations in his writing is the legacy of his father, and the processing of the grief that this writing represents. In this way, his employment of the wandering Jew type acts as a way for Nabokov to access the other world, to create a line of communication with his dead father through a liminal and defined character who travels throughout his works. In this same vein, life writing itself acts as a mediator between life and death in the resurrection and reimagination of past biographical figures. Hermione Lee also considers some Freudian theory, which describes how the bereaved ego initially refuses to acknowledge loss and regresses to fantasies of cannibalism, incorporating the lost object in order to deny its death or disappearance. We can see evidence of this in the way that Nabokov obsessively incorporates the figure of his father into the text, but perhaps also in the legend of the wandering Jew itself, who represents a figure condemned not to die, whose eternity is punishment. The character of the wandering Jew can also be used as a prototype applied to different other identities in Nabokov's works. For example, his female characters have been described by Elena Rakhimova-Summers as representations of nomadic womanhood passportless wanderers, often absent and silent, only voiced in the role of the male protagonist's intellectual and emotional anchor. Clear similarities can be seen here with the wandering Jew who travels, nameless, stateless, and voiceless, throughout Nabokov's works until he finds himself useful in order to aid the plot or protagonist. Additionally, connections can be made through Nabokov's characterizations of Jewishness and Blackness. Galia Dement has identified how Nabokov's Black characters are often hired help who aid or hinder the plot, and this can be paired with my study of the wandering Jew characters who represent authorial control and exist only to serve the protagonist. Tamar Garb suggests that the connection between Jewishness and Blackness has a historical foundation, as in some versions of 19th century racial science, the Jew was Black, and that in the racialized body of the Jew was expressed his physical and cultural otherness, an otherness which would persist even when the disguises of assimilation and integration had rid the body of its outward signifiers of difference. This considers how Nabokov's Jewish and Black characters may be written under a wider umbrella of otherness, both racialized and essentialized, inserted into the plot to serve the protagonist or represent a specific theme. Specifically, in relation to Garb's comment, the Jew doesn't need to be immediately recognized with familiar outward signifiers, but that these may be subsumed by other signifiers, such as Nabokov replacing a traditional large nose with thick eyebrows, an intentional avoidance of easily identifiable anti-Semitic markers. To conclude, the wandering Jew travels from Agosphère throughout the rest of Nabokov's oeuvre. His early imaginings of this character become a prototype for the other, a continued symbol of exile and his own emigration, and to an idea of Jewishness. But it's also a fascinating text in its own right, rich with intertextuality. As a final conclusion, in his lecture on Ulysses, Nabokov noted how Joyce chose to represent the Black sheep in the fold as he was, the type of the outsider, the type of the wandering Jew, the type of the exile. Characters throughout Nabokov's works bear familiar characteristics of this wandering Jew type: divine intervention, homelessness, namelessness, religious heresy, a movement between life and death or across borders and between languages. We can look, as a brief list, to the cosmopolitan inventor in King, Queen, Knave, who saves the protagonist's life with a phone call, the Sisyphean old Jew who appears at the crucifixion, an invitation to a beheading, the geographer Berezovsky in The Gift, who informs of the protagonist's father's death, or the multilingual Silberman in the real life of Sebastian Knight, who acts as a messenger from the other world to aid the protagonist. And beyond that, even to Humbert Humbert himself, who's described as a salad of racial genes from an indeterminate European background, and obviously a sexually perverse criminal in himself. The way that this character travels throughout his work shows how pervasive the wandering Jew theme is, but it also acts as a prototype for the other and can lead us to ask questions about the ability of Nabokov to write these other identities and what that says about his own modernist authorship.
Thank you, Anushka. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to open up for a couple of very quick questions now, but I do want to keep on time. So if anyone has got something they urgently want to ask, please do pop something in the chat or stick your hand up for me now. I might not necessarily be able to see everybody. It says lots of people. No? I'm not missing something, am I? No.
I believe Helen has something to ask.
Sorry. Thank you. Helen. So I did miss something. Helen, forgive me.
Hi.
Hi, Helen.
Thank you so much for that, Anushka. It was really interesting. I was really struck by your idea of the sort of paranoid reading. Is this your concept? Was this something that you've sort of taken from others, and how did you develop that?
It's totally stolen from Sedgwick, who uses it for her, like she develops it in terms of queer reading of queer texts and identifying queerness. And it kind of just seemed to work really well with the same idea of Jewishness, like the reading of Jewishness being paranoid. And I think also a tendency to for Jewishness not to be marked in a kind of straightforward way, this idea of slipperiness and of kind of subtextual references. And if you're looking for Jewish characters, you're relying on specific signifiers that don't really exist. And so it requires every single character to be kind of challenged and like, okay, is there something that would be secretly Jewish about this character? And I realize it works really well for the way that Nabokov wants to be read and writes to be read, with his like methods of reading and rereading. And you're meant to kind of, he says you're meant to have a pencil and take notes and have a dictionary and reread again. So it seems to work both in form and content, and the kind of reading and the writing matches. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just thought that was really interesting.
Okay, any further urgent questions that need to be asked right now? Or else we can save them for the discussion afterwards. In that case, Anushka, thank you again. And Asha, would you like to share your screen with us?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here it is. I was not aware of any fancy template to use, so I just used this one, which I felt was suitable for the material that I'm covering. For some of you, you might have some kind of deja vu. No, it's not deja vu. I have shared some of these material in some form in the past, but now I think I'm going to bring a different angle to it and probably now come to a fuller conclusion. Okay, and so my research looks at what we can learn about Jewish and Jewish-Christian relations during late antiquity through their respective interpretations of shared scripture. And a lot of work has already been done on this in other biblical books, but surprisingly little for the book of Isaiah. And I say surprisingly because the book of Isaiah contains many juicy portions which both Jews and Christians use to address matters which are, say, controversial between each other. For example, in the case here, messianism. All right. Jews and Christians both have a concept of Messiah, and for Christians, that is Jesus, and that's why they call him Christ. And for Jews, that's not him. And so, the question is, how much do we know? How much can we learn about how Jews and Christians interacted over things like that during late antiquity? And by that, I mean the 4th century to the 6th century. And well, really not a lot if you look at just going by historical biographies and narratives alone. And even when a certain narrative source tells you about an interaction, you have to take that with a pinch of salt. So what we do is we look at the exegetical material coming from both faith clusters, and we see what we can determine from that. And so what is Isaiah's given son prophecy? That's the portion in the book of Isaiah, chapter 9, verse 5, or in modern English Bibles, that will be chapter 9, verse 6. Okay, the difference has to do with the versification. I follow the versification in the Masoretic text. So here is the passage, translation by me. It says, "For a child was born to us, a son was given to us, and the rulership came out on his shoulder. And he called his name Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity, Prince of Peace." And Christmas has just passed. I can't even claim Eastern Orthodox Christmas because even that has passed. But I think this passage, if you are a churchgoer, is quite fresh in your mind, even though it may be translated a bit differently. And we will see why in a moment. I think the big difference comes from one of the big differences that pops out is this part here, if you can see my mouse, I don't know if you can, and he called his name. I think in most English translations, it is rendered in the passive, and his name is called or something like that. Yeah, okay. But if you look at the Hebrew text, at least according to the Masoretic text, we have Vayikra Shemo, okay, and that verb there is in active, right? And so that is how I've rendered it. Now, so the question is, how did Jews and Christians understand this verse? How did they exegete it, and how did they use it for their purposes? Well, let's go back to a time before there was a Christianity for Jews to grapple with. And, so about 100, 200 years before the Christian era, Jews produced a Greek translation of their Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint, or in abbreviated form, we call it LXX, meaning 70, all right? We pronounce it as Septuagint. And so every translation is an interpretation in the sense that decisions were made on how to render the source text in the target language, right? So wherever we find interesting differences, I would say, then that would be a key to understanding where the translator was coming from. So we'll start with a very easy example here. Remember, we talked about the word called, yeah? So again, in the Hebrew text, it says, and he called, but in the Septuagint, it is rendered kalite, and his name is called, okay, in the passive. So, and that has to do with the Vorlage, the underlying Hebrew text that the Septuagint translators dealt with, all right? The word alone is ambiguous, all right? It could be read as active or passive. The Septuagint translators went with passive, okay? So again, translations are not always accurate in the sense that we like to think of accuracy, right? Because each reader, each exegete of the Hebrew text will have their own ways of how to deal with it, all right? And how they eventually understand it will then signal to us certain conclusions that we can take away. More interestingly is the names that we looked at just now. It says that, and he called his name Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, and if you have heard this passage preached before, it is likely that you have heard it pointed out that the child's name, right? The child in this text is called Mighty God, all right? In Hebrew, El Gibor, okay? But look at how the Septuagint translators have chosen to render this, right? Megalis Bules Angelos, messenger of great counsel. Now that's very different, okay? And it's a very interesting way to render, very differently from what we would expect, okay? But suffice to say, I think one takeaway from this rendering is that the Septuagint translators didn't exactly take this part of the name as anything divine, all right, as indicating that this child was somehow divine. They didn't think like that when they were grappling with the Hebrew text before them, all right? The other part of the name, rendered Father of Eternity, Prince of Peace, the Septuagint takes it instead as a kind of sentence, for I will lead peace on rulers, right? And then I won't explain in detail how they got that, but again, some things we need to take note of, when we talk about ancient translations, so that we do not import our modern notions of translation back to them. Okay, we'll just skip this part for now. Okay, Dead Sea Scrolls, again, 100, 200 years before the time of the Christian era. And this is 1Q Hodayot. It is a poem. Well, the scroll contains a a collection of poems, but in this particular poem, we have line 11 here, and we see that there is an allusion to the given son prophecy in Isaiah, and we know that because of the terms that were used. Pele Yoetz, the wonderful counselor, the word for might, Geburato, is cognate to the word El Gibor, mighty God. And again, Gever is also cognate to that term, right? So these terms used in proximity to one another signals to us that the poet was probably alluding or borrowing the language of Isaiah's given son prophecy. And what do we observe here again? Pele Yoetz, El Gibor. I don't think that the poet, when he looked at Isaiah's given son prophecy, I don't think he thought that the child was somehow divine. Okay, that's the long and short of it. So already Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls, we find that. Okay, I missed out. Okay, let's see if I have the New Testament here. Okay, slide 21. Let me jump to the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke. I am going to include this as a Jewish source, all right? Because let's remember the first Christians were Jewish, right? Christianity began as a denomination of Jewish religion. And so I would count and include the New Testament writings as Jewish exegetical sources. And so here the well-known story about the angel appearing to Mary, okay, verse 31 quotes actually from Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. That's the very famous virgin birth prophecy, which I deal with in another place. But in verse 32, not an exact quote, but we see an allusion, all right? Especially in verse 33, it says, and he referring to Jesus, and he will reign over the house of Jacob unto the ages, and of his kingdom there will be no end. This is actually the verse after that, in verse 6 rather than verse 5, okay? So we see here that there is an allusion to that given son prophecy. And again, note that there is no hint that the child, all right, was somehow divine. Okay, very quickly now we go to slide 12. Jewish exegetical sources after the Second Temple period. Okay, so this is around the 1st, 2nd century and beyond. The first one we'll look at is Targum Isaiah. Now, Targum means translation, but again, remember, translations are not always in the sense that we think of them. And I point out here again, the passive is used for the word for called, but more importantly, now we have the names rendered in this way. Mafli Isa Elaha Gibbara, wonderful counsel, God, mighty one. So very interesting. The Septuagint did not take that name as anything divine, but here in Targum Isaiah, the name is taken as divine, right? Elaha, God. However, and another thing to note is that Targum Isaiah explicitly names this child as the Messiah, Meshiach. Okay, that's not in the text. All right, if you go back to the given son prophecy, that's not in the text, and in the Septuagint we don't find that either. But the Targums explicitly name the Messiah. All right, so it shows us their theology. All right, or the way they treat this text. So, but notice how the God, all right, is distanced from the Messiah. There is a clear separation here. No, the child, these names, these are not the names of the child. These are the names of the person who named the child. All right, the child is the Messiah, but he is not the one to whom the names are ascribed. Okay, so let's see. Likewise, let's look at other sources, Jewish sources from this time. Leviticus Rabbah quotes the given son prophecy and assigns it to Hezekiah, one of the previous kings of Judah. All right. So interesting. Targum Isaiah thinks that this child is the Messiah. Leviticus Rabbah thinks that it's Hezekiah. Likewise, Ruth Rabbah thinks that the given child prophecy was spoken of Hezekiah, not the Messiah. And I make a point to show that the King Messiah is ascribed a different verse instead. All right. And the point here is that, look, the Messiah is not the child that is spoken of. Very, very interesting. All right. So we are seeing here a diversity of views among the Jewish exegetes. All right. So we don't like to think about the Jews say, or the Jews believe, as if there is one monolithic Judaism, right? I like to speak of Judaisms, and that is why I refer to Jewish religion as a faith cluster, so that we don't fall into that trap of thinking, Jews as if they're all the same and believe the same, right? Even their sources bear out that there were different angles, different nuances to how they understood the same passage of scripture. So we look at a summary here, okay? A summary of what we have seen. 3 different post-Second Temple Jewish sources, all right? One says that the child is the Messiah, but that the name, the divine names do not refer to the child. Whereas in the other sources, in Leviticus Rabbah, it's not clear whether the child is the Messiah. Okay, Ruth Rabbah, the child is not the Messiah. The child is not the Messiah, and then the name refers to the child. Okay, so just to give a summary of the different Jewish views. Looking at the time, okay, let's go to the Christian side of the story. All right, Christian sources. Justin Martyr simply says, oh, Isaiah said that this child was the messenger of great counsel. Did he say that? No, not really. The Hebrew text says mighty God, all that. But you see, Justin Martyr, as many other Christians of his time, they were not exactly using the Hebrew text for their Old Testament, okay? But they were using the Septuagint. And so Justin Martyr, looking at his Septuagint, all right, he has the name of the child as messenger of great counsel, okay? And apparently he was not aware of the Hebrew rendering because he would certainly have used it, all right? And we see this actually in successive generations of Christians. They do use the Hebrew text to that effect. Okay, so for example, Eusebius of Caesarea here, he says in his Septuagint, the term messenger of great counsel is there. But then he goes on to say that, hey, there are other Jewish translations which say different things. And very interestingly, he has access one way or another to a Hebrew text. And he points out that, hey, the word El means God. Okay, and so he's going to use that to say that, to prove in his mind that the child equals Jesus equals God. Okay, likewise, Theodoret does that, all right? And he even has a reference back to chapter 7, verse 14, where the name Immanuel occurs, and he says, oh, look, the word El occurs there as well. El is God, and therefore Jesus is God, But Justin Martyr didn't do that, right? We saw Justin Martyr didn't do that, all right? And when you read the rest of his dialogue with Trypho, he does that if he can, right? So if he can't, that's very interesting. So I'll just end off with the let's see if I can. I wonder if I can squeeze this in. Okay, let's squeeze this in. Okay, let's look at Christian copies of the Septuagint. All right, so we have here Codex Vaticanus, and it gives us more or less what we saw in the Septuagint that we discussed previously, right? Messenger of great counsel, for I will lead peace on rulers and health to him. Okay, nothing interesting here. What we want to remember is that for all sources of antiquity, we don't have the original copies, all right? I know in some areas of history, we have a source and it's like, we have the originals, right? We have this person's handwriting, right? He actually wrote this thing and we can make reference to it. But in the case of ancient sources, we do not have any of this, all right? What we have when we say that this ancient author wrote this, what we are saying is that we have copies of copies of copies of what this author wrote, all right? And we have to look at the different copies to find out and piece them together to find out what that author really wrote, okay? And so when we consider it that way, we find that the Septuagint is no different. And this is what I found in my research, that, the Septuagint, many of us, in our field, we say the Septuagint as if there was only one thing, all right? But actually, if we look at the manuscript tradition, the way that the text has been passed down, it tells a very interesting story on its own. So if we look at, say, Codex Alexandrinus, all right? So this is another manuscript of the Septuagint. You would find that there is this portion in blue that was added in between Messenger of Great Counsel and the rest of it, right? So look at that, Messenger of Great Counsel, and then in between, we have this addition: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty, Authoritative, Ruler of Peace, Father of the Coming Age, right? And essentially, this is a more literal rendering of the Hebrew text, which was not present in the Septuagint, okay? We also find this in Codex Sinaiticus, all right? Not in the main text, okay? The main text has the traditional Septuagint rendering, but the producer of Codex Sinaiticus has marked out an addition, right? And put it in the footnotes. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. It's there, right? The more literal rendering is there, but in the footnotes. So, all right, so we see here three different ways that Christians deal with this more literal rendering, right? Codex Vaticanus, for most of the manuscript tradition, it's not even there, right? And most probably they were unaware of this rendering. But for some, right, for some of the manuscript tradition, this more literal rendering made it into the main text. The question is why? And I think I have a good guess, right? It's because this more literal rendering helps the Christian cause to prove that Jesus or the child spoken of here is divine, right? And for other parts of the manuscript tradition, it's not in the main text, but we find it in the footnote, all right? Now, this doesn't always happen. There are other areas where the more literal rendering is different from the traditional Septuagint, but only here, in very few places, do we find that the producer of the manuscript found it necessary to include this more literal rendering in the footnotes, okay? So let's bring it all together. And here is my the conclusion when we look at all the evidence put together. Well, firstly, the Jewish sources disagree on whether the child was the Messiah or whether the name indicated divinity, right? We saw that in the summary I gave, right? So the Jewish sources will disagree on how to take it, but you know what? They are all united in excluding the Christian view that the Messiah was divine, right? So their point, in all their disagreement, their point of unity is very interesting. Now, secondly, Christian writers varied on their awareness of the Hebrew text, all right? We saw that Justin Martyr was not aware of it. And those Christians who were more aware of it used it. They made reference to it. They didn't do this all the time, all right? But when it helped their case, they used it to great effect, okay? And thirdly, Christian scribes, when they were passing down the text of the Septuagint, all right, those scribes who were aware of it, they interpolated the Hebraized reading, the more literal reading of the text into their manuscripts, whether in the main text or in the footnote. All right. So and all this is, these 3 points are what I say, are what caused me to say that, it's not explicit. We don't find any documentation of this, but under the table, between the lines, we can find this hidden story of a dialogue between Jews and Christians during late antiquity. Thank you.
Thank you, Asher. Wow, this has been really, really interesting. What a fascinating pair of papers. Asher, I wonder if there are any questions for you straight off immediately. Is anyone putting their hand up that I can't see or jumping in? Yes, someone, Will, in the corner for me.
Okay, this presentation has been very informative, and I would like to ask Asher if there's anywhere I can find a similar analysis of Psalm 82 with attention to the Hebrew text and the way Jesus quotes it in the Gospel of John, because that is the one which has the lines in translation, God stands among the gods, and I have said you are gods. And whenever I have asked people about this, their response is just, you're a Christian out to get us, go away. And anything Christian is ipso facto wrong.
Yeah, I feel you. Is there any a similar examination of regarding Psalm 82? Not that I can think of from the top of my head, but you might want to check out, let's see, Alan Seagal, I am probably butchering his name, Two Powers in Heaven, who might have addressed this.
I'm looking for that. There doesn't seem to be any Psalms Rabbah or whatever.
There is a Psalms Rabbah, but whether such an examination has been done, I don't think so.
Then I will certainly want to examine that. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Any other immediate questions for Asher? Thank you, Deborah. That's really lovely. Rich and fascinating papers. Many congratulations to you both. Wish I could stay for the Q&A, but sadly can't. So, okie doke. If there's no other immediate questions, why don't we move into a kind of a more just more of a discursive section of the evening. So again, are there people who would like to kind of draw out any comparisons between the two papers, or any observations that having these two papers side by side can kind of start to bring out? Claire, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I had actually a question for Asha.
Oh, sorry.
No. I just raised my hand too late, and I'm absolutely not a specialist, so apologies if it's a stupid question. It's, first of all, it's really fascinating in both cases how you master languages first. It's absolutely impressive in both cases. To Asha, I find it really impressive to see how you are able to spot the, well, in a way, the intertextuality, a bit like Anushka has. There is a lot in common in your papers, actually. And how you can see what they take, what they change, what they amend, and how they modify their interpretations and their translations. My main question is, how do you situate that in the time and in the chronology? And can you identify actually key moments when Christian interpreters or commentators used more the Hebraized, or is there a chronological pattern? No.
Okay, yes, I understand what you mean. I think there are two questions there. The first one dropped my mind. Let's see if I can situate this in the time. Okay, I'm situating this in late antiquity, right, 4th to 6th century. But by no means does this mean that the traditions and interpretations belong to that time. They could very well have been coined or originated in an earlier time. But when I date the sources, what I am saying is that this interpretation was at least still current during that time. Okay, so for example, when I say Justin Martyr, now he is 2nd century, all right. So what I'm saying is that by the 2nd century, by that cutoff, right, his interpretation was then. And then, but when we look at successive Christian sources, we find that, hey, now they are pointing out the Hebrew text, which Justin did not do. Mm-hmm. So if you want me to give a little progression, so to speak, I will say that as a trend, the 2nd century Christian sources, including those that we call early church fathers, I don't find a lot that they make reference to Hebrew. All right, they are relying most heavily on the Septuagint, and it's only in, say, the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century that they start to reference Hebrew. And they start to, it's very interesting that they write out Hebrew words, but in Greek letters, right? So, they transliterate, that's the term for it. So that's the trend, right? And it seems that, and why I'm able to so definitively say that is because when I read people like Justin Martyr, we call apologists, those who defend their faith against, including Jews, right? If they have something that they can use, they will. Okay, and they did not use the Hebrew text, whereas the later generations of Christians did. Okay, so that's how I built the case for that progression. Yeah, hope that answered the question.
Can I add another question, Anna?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, of course, Claire. I was wondering whether you were muted or not. Sorry.
Well, and about this question of translation, because I know, Anushka, that you also use that translation is also very important in your text. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about what you learned from the way Nabokov self-translated himself. What does it tell you about his relationship to Jewishness or to the Jewish theme?
Yeah, I guess the translation element of the research has two sides to it. So first off, the translation of Agasphere was a kind of starting point for the research because I found this text and it hadn't been translated. And I think the process, or like the methodology behind translating it, required a lot of intertextuality and kind of a wider understanding of Nabokov's other writing. I think an interesting point is that one of the reasons why Agasphere hasn't been translated or discussed in scholarship much is that the general view is that Nabokov completely disavowed the text, as he did with much of his early poetry. And there are some scholars who actually doubt his authorship, even though it says his pseudonym is on the published prologue, but he did it as a collaborative work. And what's interesting is that there's another poem sequence from around the same time called the Angels sequence, which is a series of, I think, 11 or 12 poems, which are very biblical in theme. And there are lots of overlaps in the specific images and language that's used. And there's also phrases that he uses in Agasphere, which he uses at the same time writing in letters to Vera when they're first courting, to show the kind of romantic element of it. But what's helpful about that is that I can see the same phrases in images and words in other texts and kind of gauge the true meaning from those contexts. And then the kind of wider theory of translation, what's really great about studying Nabokov, but also much more time consuming, is that he either translated or authorized the translation of all of his works from Russian into English and vice versa. So everything that he wrote in Russian, he then translated or authorized translations of into English when he was in America. And then later in life, he also translated lots of his English texts back into Russian. So what's interesting about that is that there is there's a gap in time, and he almost rewrites these texts. And so, for example, there's really interesting elements in the Russian version of Lolita where he makes Humbert Humbert's coded Jewishness more explicit, and he also directly references kind of anti-Semitism that Humbert is perceived to experience. And so it adds not only an interesting textual analysis, but demonstrates the fact that Nabokov was knowingly writing for a different audience. So when he writes a Russian translation of Lolita, he's doing it with the full knowledge that this is going to be a samizdat text that's going to go into the Soviet Union. But he would rather be in control of the Russian translation himself than have it kind of be an average job done by someone like Black Market Publishing. But it means that kind of every text has a double, but a kind of vaguely double that isn't quite accurate. And it means that specific references can then be kind of checked against the mirrored translation and see whether he's added things or changed things. And so, yeah, the translation and the kind of ability to look at the text in both English and Russian really opens things up. And I think is an important kind of more unique element to my research, because existing articles that look on Jewishness are much more limited because they're article length. And actually with the PhD, I have the time and space to look at the kind of double versions of these texts.
Thank you. Can I also just second Claire in being highly impressed by your command of multiple languages, both of you. Really amazing. But I see there's a question from Matthew. Matthew, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question for Anushka. First of all, wonderful job. I am so excited about this research. So I was reminding myself while you're talking about what Andrea Pitzer has talked about in her book on Nabokov, where she argues that Humbert I think she argues that he is in fact Jewish, at least partly. And that's a kind of source of irony, because he's repeatedly suspected of being Jewish throughout the novel, at the same time that everybody's turning a blind eye to his treatment of Dolores, right? Which implies that, at least in America, people were more comfortable with pedophilia than they were with Jewishness, right? And I know she mentions The Wandering Jew in that book as well, but I'm interested in, first of all, do you sort of track with her reading of the novel? And then secondly, I'm interested in sort of, do you feel like there's the Lolita is a kind of New World spin on the Wandering Jew tale? And if so, I mean, what is the particular spin? What's he doing with that in Lolita?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I think every time I come to think of it, I really struggle to come to a conclusion because I think it's a really thorny issue. I don't think that Humbert is Jewish. I think it's more important that the characters in the novel think that he is, and I think it kind of doesn't matter whether he is or not. I think the important questions to ask are, why, if like he is coded Jewish, or at least characters think he is, so why has Nabokov done this? I think some people can kind of graciously suggest that he does this in order to draw attention to and criticize the anti-Semitism and racism of like Middle America, because he experiences this anti-Semitism mostly when he's on the road, when he goes to motels and things like that, and also from Quilty. And so these kind of posh, losty, vulgar characters who assume, oh, Humbert's this kind of vague European person who's arrived after the war, he must be Jewish. I think that's probably a gracious analysis. I think at the heart of it, there is still a suggestion, and we see this from Agus Fair, this association of the wandering Jew with sexual perversity and sinfulness. And there's an undeniable link there with Nazi propaganda as well, and a general idea of like an effeminate, circumcised male Jew, or one who is interested in younger girls or has this kind of criminality and dirtiness to them. And I think that's an undeniable link. And so I think if I decide to come to the conclusion that Humbert is coded Jewish because he's sexually perverse, I think that raises really difficult but interesting questions. I think that there's an added interesting element in terms of I've been looking at female Jewishness in Nabokov's works and references to Sarah Bernhard and Salome, and Humbert describes Lolita as Salome, talking about how she dances for him and then he's going to give her a reward. And so I think it's interesting if he seems to portray her through this Jewish context as well, in a way to kind of vindicate himself. I think in the second question, this idea of like a post-Holocaust wandering Jew, which I think is a phrase that Andrea Pitzer uses, I think there's definitely something interesting there. The sense that the wandering Jew ultimately is a hopeful character because, at least in a Christian lens, he will eventually be free. And when the second coming comes, then the wandering Jew will be able to die, and that will be his freedom. There's a really interesting, I can't remember if it's a short story or a novel by Boris Kazanov, where it talks about the wandering Jew, and the wandering Jew is in the line for the gas chambers at Auschwitz next to Jesus. And this sense that actually in a Holocaust or a post-Holocaust world, there is no kind of relief or liberation or freedom or kind of peaceful death for either of them. And so I think that it could be seen that in a post-Holocaust context, everything's so distorted and so beyond the realms of what we imagine to be acceptable in writing or in literature, that there could be a world in which the wandering Jew is this most horrific criminal, and that there's associations with that. And I think it does think about that kind of postmodern limits of fiction and of reality and morality. But I think I'm still working my head around it. I haven't decided what I'm going to conclude yet, but it's a really interesting one. So thank you for asking.
Thank you. I can see that Helen, you have your hand up. So please jump in.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. I am always really interested in methodology, and I thought that both of you were really authoritative in the way that you actually talked about the sort of method behind your work. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit actually how you arrived at your methodology, because I know from someone that does a lot of work around methods, you have to go through a long process really of thinking about how you're going to reach that final point that you're at now, where you've actually just made these sort of decisions. So could you say a little bit about that process that took you to the methodology you're at now, and the sorts of decisions you had to make and what obstacles you faced in making those decisions? I don't mind who goes first.
I go first? Okay. So, Helen, as you know, I began with my methodology by stealing from you. Yeah, essentially just, in my mindset as a new person doing this, right, was that, these people are so much wiser than me, I can't possibly improve on their methodology, so I just stole it, wholesale and, tried to apply it. But then after going through the sources, after copiously reading through them, I found that actually that's still not comprehensive, enough for my purposes, right? And so I think really my methodology was shaped by the sources. It was formed by, after getting a hold, a grasp, and understanding of how these sources came to be and their historical context. All right, and so only then was I able to look in places where previously I would never have thought to look. I gave the example of the Septuagint's manuscript tradition. Everyone I know just says the Septuagint says this, but little did I know that if I looked at the manuscripts, I would say, well, the differences in the traditions, even that mattered and could tell a story. Yeah.
Can I interfere? Does it mean that nobody before you actually compared the different manuscripts of the steps?
Well, they certainly did, but only to produce a critical edition with variants in the footnotes, right? They always want to go back to the original Septuagint. And right now, I think in my mind, I don't think there was an original Septuagint, right? That there was a translation effort, all right? And many times you will get the same Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? But the rest of the translation is, varies in other less known areas.
So interesting. Anushka?
I also stole my methodology. I think that's the only way to do it, right? Well, I didn't really believe that methodology existed. I knew it was a thing that people talked about and I couldn't really understand what it was. And then it got to near the summer and I was like, oh, I really do have to work on this now. And then I think the main idea was trying to work out I went back to research questions and what are the main themes. And then I got given by my supervisors a nice long reading list. So I spent 2 months in the British Library deciding if I agreed with things. And mostly, and then I wrote it and then I was like, oh, this all makes sense and this is methodology. I think the one that I struggled more with, and I don't know whether it will kind of become clearer, was the historical side of it, which I didn't include because I just, it didn't feel relevant to this bit. But there was a wider question about, my understanding is that the historical context informed the literature, but am I also able to suggest that the literature informs history and historical ideas and questions? And I struggled much more with that, I think, because I'm not a historian, even though I think people want me to be, or I could pretend to be one. And I couldn't quite work it out. And I think I was looking at new historicism, which I suppose is not really history, it's English. And I came, I was looking at thick description and anthropology, and I was like, oh, this is all great, and it's not history. So I don't know, but my final section looks much more about history and writing history. And so I don't know whether it will kind of come back to it then. But I think if I'm thinking about it as a living methodology that can evolve through things, then yeah, that's the one that I struggled with most. But the psychoanalysis and the ideas of Jewishness and the ideas of paranoid reading just came from reading and then writing about it.
Oh, thank you so much both. I just always find it so interesting because we often see the sort of final product, but so much thinking has gone into that to make it the shape it is. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, and it's really revealing, isn't it, to see the different strands of disciplines that are informing what you're working on, and that's just what a joy that is to be able to discuss that, and to discuss that kind of in a situation like a Park seminar, which does bring in so many different disciplines and benefits from that conversation across those boundaries. It's really interesting to see. Are there any further questions or other points people want to explore further, or points of comparison or anything further?
Can I go again? I'm sorry.
You can,
I have a question too. I mean, also because we discussed that with Anushka, but the question of digital humanities, because technological aspects of methodology. I mean, you are the next generation. We talk a lot about digital humanities and digital Jewish studies. I don't know if, well, Anushka, you could explain how you want to use the digital methods, and if Asha, in your case, it is something that is increasingly used and that is helpful if you want to compare the use of vocabularies, or if it's not possible because there are manuscripts. I don't know, yeah.
I can start by, so I'm hoping to do a bit of a digital project where the plan is, because digital editions of all of the novels and short stories exist in PDFs and ebooks or whatever, to basically produce a list of searchable terms and map them across the different texts to find references to those terms, and then do the same with the Russian versions and look at, for example, if there's the word Jew in an English novel, does that come up in the translation? So there's like the first step is to basically see the cross translation, English to Russian, Russian to English. Do these references come up in the same way? Are they changed? But there's a kind of further complexity, which I think is what makes it more interesting, is that, as I was saying before with the paranoid reading, the references to Jewish characters are rarely the Jewish character, this person, you know, and it's rarely a very straightforward description or necessarily a Jewish name. And so it requires kind of a creation of a bit of a list of what I can see to be the ways, the words and phrases and images that Nabokov uses as his kind of alternate Jewish references. And hopefully it will create quite an interesting, almost encyclopedia of, or like a semantic field of how he describes Jewishness, and being able to map that across the two versions, and also see like a frequency. Like I don't think I would be surprised if there is some sort of Jewish reference in every major text that he writes. And I think it would be really interesting to be able to visualize that and kind of have like a data-driven conclusion in that way.
Okay, well, my full-time job, I'm a software engineer. That's my full-time job. And my first degree from the University of Southampton was computer science. So, you know, very naturally, when I got into this project, my first thought is, how can I make my life as easy as possible, right? And this is a very happy coincidence, situation, because Hebrew and Greek writing, right, the Jewish and Christian literature utilizes heavily intertextuality. So it was no accident that I pulled up 1Q Hodayot, right? And, you know, with all that, I did a Control F. That's what I did, you know, search for the terms, yeah. And, you know, the poet in 1Q Hodayot is not going to say, here is my quote, bracket, Isaiah 9:5, close bracket. They don't do that, right? They use certain terms and they expect you to pick up that they are alluding to that biblical passage, right? So, and so very, very fortunately, most of the Jewish sources that I'm working with have already been digitalized, right? And in terms of Greek and Latin sources, they have been accidentally digitalized. Patrologia Graeca and Latina are on Google Books for free. And because of the power of Google, you know, you can actually search the text, right? And so that's where I've been doing my searches and have been coming up with the results. So yes, very, very useful. And I think this is the way forward.
I think the key thing is that I think it makes our lives easier. And also, there's no human error where you would inevitably miss a reference or you would inevitably skip something. And so, yeah, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. Will talked about Sepharia. Yeah, that's one good resource right there, Sepharia. For a quick search. Yeah.
Yes, searchability is a real boon. Is a real boon. Going through inscriptions, just to go back to my own old PhD days, going through inscriptions in paper, where you're like, I'm just looking for each one, and then there's 1,000 of them, and you just go, this is like a year of my time. It's extremely boring. Still, anyway, I'm here now. Only a little bit jaded. I think there's a question from Yuri. Yuri, do you want to jump in? Oh,
yeah, thank you. So I found the two talks very interesting and very connected, but I have questions that are completely unrelated, like to one another. So I'm sorry about that. I wanted to ask Asher about Vaikra Shmo. So you mentioned the sort of mistranslation where, well, maybe not mistranslation, but a chosen translation, because I would agree that the word can mean both things equally. And if you can talk about situations in which it was understood not in the way that would later lead into the Christian direction, and like in later Jewish texts that reference that word in that setting. And as I said, very unrelatedly, Anushka, I was wondering if we know of Nabokov reading Jewish authors, like being influenced by Jewish authors.
Sorry, what was that second question?
That was for Anushka about Nabokov.
Oh, okay. So, all right. Vayikra Shemo. So in form, right? Vayikra is active. So right. So the proper translation would be, and he called his name. Okay. But if you have the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, right, the critical edition, the footnote says that it could be taken as, because Hebrew is originally written unvoweled, right? The vowels were added later on by the Masoretes, and the vowels are critical because depending on what vowels you put there, you could come up with a totally different meaning, right? So the vowels that were put in by the Masoretes reads Vayikra, and he called, right? But the critical edition will acknowledge that this could also be read as Vayikare Nif'al, right? The Nif'al, so passive, and his name is called, all right? And so that was the translation that was preferred by the Septuagint, right? Not because they were mistranslating something, but they saw the unvoweled form and they read it as Nif'al, the passive, right? Likewise, Targum Isaiah read it as passive, all right? But later on, when the Masoretes, whenever they did it, they added the vowels, the expressed vowels, which then gave the term an active nuance, Vaikra, and he called. Now, I didn't cover this, but the possible difference that makes, okay, if you look at the cantillation as well, right, you will see two major cantillation signs in the text. And essentially, if you honor that cantillation together with the active form, you can actually read the text in this way. Instead of the child's name being called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, it is instead that not Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, what was it? What's the third one? Everlasting Father. Instead of the child being called those names, it is actually those names, the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, and Everlasting Father, called the child's name Prince of Peace. Okay, so that is one of the doors that open up if you take that word for called as active. Okay, whereas if that word, if called, was passive, Vaikare, then this possibility is not even there. All right. So I would think this is a theory. I am not. I am 70% there and getting there, but I think the Masoretic text with the vowels and the cantillations was meant to convey that those terms, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Father of Eternity, is meant to be assigned to God rather than the child. and it makes all the difference.
Thank you.
It really does. It's
Um,
so interesting.
Sorry, did
any-
that fly? Did that fly over your heads? I'm so
No,
sorry.
no. Anushka?
I have quite a quick answer. Like the question of what Nabokov read or didn't read, or what he liked or didn't like, he used to write lists of whether he thought authors were good or not. In terms of Jewish authors that he read, I would say probably their Jewishness was kind of secondary, like not the reason that he read them. Like, you know, he loved Proust, he loved Kafka, Mandelstam, some of the like Jewish Russian poets of that period. I think the Proust one is interesting because there's definitely maybe similarities there with some of the ideas of writing Jewishness there. And I guess the interesting one was like the reference to his identifying Joyce and the Wandering Jew together. Obviously Joyce not Jewish, but the Jewishness in the novel, when he wrote his lectures for when he was teaching at Cornell, so he's clearly aware of it as a literary theme, but doesn't kind of go out of his way to read or not read Jews, I think.
Thank you. We have time for one more question because I am aware that it is 3:30 in the morning for Asher. So Mark, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sorry, my camera's not working, but I'm a professor of theater and performance in the United States, working on a book about European churches and Chinese temples. So I found this discussion very interesting. My PhD is actually in English, so the literary side with Nabokov is intriguing regarding the Wandering Jew. And I was, in my mind, relating that to Asher's exploration of the various texts and the kind of wandering child that appears in different forms between the religions as well as the languages. And it reminded me of Handel's Messiah as well, which I was hearing in my head with some of those phrases, but also imagery in European churches of, you know, the mature Jesus as counselor, as Prince of Peace, and how that relates to Madonna figures holding the child, but how all of that involves, and this is what I'm struggling with, somewhat like Anushka maybe mentioned with Nabokov, I'm struggling with the bloody history of it too, and how there's an appropriation of terms and ideas that then are used to create beautiful works of art. So do you view them, maybe both of you can respond, but especially Asher, do you view the appropriation of phrases and translation and then, you know, extreme emphasis on the divine depictions as inspirations or problematic appropriations between languages, religions, and cultures?
Interesting question. I won't automatically assign the problematic, that judgment to the way that, either Jews or Christians in the sources have understood, dealt with, and used the biblical text, right? Because I don't necessarily know that it came from an intention of trying to change the text for some reason. I don't know that. All right, I can only present very interesting data points and then come away that there was some sort of encounter, but the exact nature of the encounter we won't know for sure, right? Where it originated, how exactly, who was the first to invent or twist the biblical passage. No, we don't want to make such judgments where we cannot, right? So and I would think that both faith clusters, and even within the faith clusters, each exegete could interpret the text differently, right? But it has to do with it had to do with what they understood from the text. and they each had a different view and treatment of the text, rather than, they hadn't necessarily had an axe to grind. Yeah, so I hope that that was that helped.
Whereas I am very happy to make a judgment and say that I think it's a tricky one to be like, okay, Nabokov is taking this explicitly anti-Semitic motif, and I've gone through thinking about whether he attempts to reappropriate it, whether he attempts to divorce it from its kind of anti-Semitic context, and kind of rebrand it as this kind of more universal idea of Jewishness or idea of exile. And I think what is clear from the literary influences that are found in Agasphere is that he's taking this motif from its much more romantic context of Pushkin and Byron, who view it as this kind of not Jewish figure, of someone who's just kind of an exile and kind of melancholy. But I think the fact that he then deliberately reattributes Jewishness to it, I think is more on the side of him actively engaging with an anti-Semitic motif, and the way that he writes this character is a kind of other who is seconded to the sidelines and exists only to aid protagonists or aid plots, and isn't afforded kind of the complexity or dimensions that you would hope for a kind of reimagined Jewishness. And so I think we can, or I'm happy to kind of go on the side of this is kind of appropriation of Jewishness for literary means, but from an interesting angle of the fact that it's not a Jewish character, it's not a Jewish motif, which probably makes it even more interesting or kind of peculiar that he chooses it.
Yeah. Oh, I would add that I wouldn't say that the appropriation necessarily takes place in this level, but even at a higher level, we must remember that the Christian movement owes its roots to Jewish religion anyway, right? So I don't know if you want to call that appropriation, or is it just a natural outgrowth of that, right? And then we don't want to anachronistically accuse Christians of appropriation, right? Yeah, when it's a development, I would say.
Okay.
Thank you both. This has been an excellent discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you for your question, Mark. And thank you to our wonderful speakers. It is probably time to call it an evening, if only so that Asher gets a bit of sleep before his job tomorrow. But Asher, thank you so much for taking the time, making the time for us in the middle of the night. Amazing. And Anushka, thank you so much for coming along and for both of your really very, very excellent and interesting presentations. It's a real pleasure to hear you about your research. And I look forward to hearing about it again soon.
Thank you, Anna, for chairing and organising.
No worries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very proud of
everybody for all the questions.
Parks PGR's work. And the next event is Holocaust and Memorial Day, 25th of January. So if you can come, or it will be online, information on the website.